Hey, how's it going? So I'm a bit of a history buff. I like to spend my time perusing YouTube for different videos about history. The Middle Ages in particular during this stage has been quite interesting to me. But during my searches, I've been unable to find one big chunky video about the entirety of the Middle Ages. It's usually just a couple series and like some short videos about key points, not one comprehensive guide to the entirety of the Middle Ages. Let's talk. So going into this, I had the intention of making a video about the entirety of the Middle Ages. I'll mention it in a second, but the Middle Ages is split into separate eras, and as you can tell by the title of this video, I'm just talking about the early Middle Ages. I really wanted to make a video about all of it, but as you can probably guess, 1,000 years of human history is a pain in the buttocks to edit. So in summary, if at any point this man mentions something about the entirety of the Middle Ages, do not listen to him, he is insane. But I've spotted a gap in the market and I intend on filling it. Now I got a lot of the information for this video from Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt, though as far as I'm aware it is completely accurate. I'm also just trying to go over the key events. I might miss some smaller things that you might have thought were important. But look, at the end of the day, not everyone cares as much about the Khazar Empire as you do. And I am predominantly talking about European history. I know, it's just, for the sake of time, again, I have to stick to like one theme. I will obviously still be mentioning Asia and the Middle East, but it's going to be predominantly focused on what's happening in Europe. Also, you might notice that the video looks a little bit, what do the kids say, bad. Yeah, that's because I usually film during the night because the lighting is more consistent. That should give you an idea of how unprofessional my setup is. You will just have to put up with it, I'm sorry. So the Middle Ages is usually split into three different categories: the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. But starting obviously with the early Middle Ages, or as you probably have heard it called, the Dark Ages. Now, the term Dark Age was coined in the 14th century because there was general lack of knowledge about that period, therefore a Dark Age. Also, people were under the assumption that everything that wasn't in the 14th century was terrible and bad and awful, so again, Dark Age. That isn't true, however. Things also really sucked in the 14th century. But the point is, the early Middle Ages start after the fall of Rome. Now, massive parts of Europe were controlled by Rome, but after years of infighting and poor decisions and terrible leaders, Rome was now just a shell of its former self. So in 476, a barbarian general, Odoacer, sacked Western Rome and deposed the emperor. There was now no longer a centralized government over Europe, and conflict between the barbarians was inevitable. Speaking of which, the Franks, who are predecessors to France, are having a scuffle with the Alemanni in 496. The Franks are led by Clovis the Great, fighting an unnamed Alemanni general. Probably guess how the battle went. Initially, the battle was going south for the Franks. Clovis was reported to call out to the god of his wife for help, and as he was speaking, the Alemanni general was killed with an axe, causing the Alemanni to break and flee. And continuing on with that, 11 years later in 507, the growing powers of the Franks causes tension with the Visigoths. Now, the Ostrogothic king, Theodoric, is kind of all like, whoa, like, what's all this? Maybe we can calm down and talk about this. But no, Clovis isn't having any of it, and he instead starts a campaign into the Visigothic kingdom. So the Franks fight the Visigoths in the Battle of Vouillers. Clovis orders his missile troops in the back and orders his infantry to attack the Visigothic line. Despite outnumbering the Franks, most of their commanders were actually killed in the melee, including Aelric, who was supposedly killed by Clovis in combat. their lines break and the Franks plunder their center of power, Toulouse. Over in the south, the Eastern Roman Empire is forming Byzantine under Justinian I. Things seem dandy until a little thing called the bubonic plague hits Constantinople in 541, killing about 40% of its occupants, including infecting Justinian himself, though he would later recover. It peters out a bit in 542, and thankfully Europe would never be hit by a mass plague again. During this time, starting around 535, Byzantine goes to war with multiple different Gothic kingdoms with the intention of regaining parts of Western Rome. Belisarius, Justinian's general, lands in Sicily, and by 536, large parts of Sicily are now part of Byzantine. Throughout the years, they continue to plow through Sicily, destroying any Gothic armies they see, and by the time they get to Rome, it just gives up without a fight. The Visigoths were understandably pretty miffed, even more so at their king Theodad, who did jack all about it. So they just kicked him out and replaced him with a guy called Vitiges. Vitiges gathers an army and quickly besieges Rome, with Belisarius and his armies still in it. Things are looking bad for the Byzantines, but thankfully reinforcements arrive from the rear and start attacking Visigothic cities. Also, the Byzantine navy blockades the area and cuts off seaborne supplies to the Visigothic army. With all this pressure, Vestiges was eventually forced to retreat. Hurrah! Victory for the Byzantines, except one little problem. The campaign cost a lot of money, time, and resources, all of which Justinian could have and probably should have used elsewhere. But it's fine, okay? It's fine. It's a victory for Byzantine, and nothing bad will happen to them in, say, 900 years. Speaking of which, some other stuff happens during this period, like some famous people being born, but honestly, I don't really care, so we're just going to jump to the Sasanian War with Byzantine in 602. Way back when, in 53 BC, the Romans lost a brutal war against the Persians, and ever since the two nations have had a grudge against each other. And that leads us to 602 in Byzantine. Present Emperor Phocas had just previously deposed the old emperor, which sounds good for him, but it wasn't. You see, people started to rebel, and the Sasanians, or previously the Persians, used this instability to attack Byzantine and reclaim some of their old cities. The war continued to go very unfavourably for Byzantine until a guy called Heraclius said, "Frick this," and smashed into Constantinople, deposing the emperor. It took a while, but by 622 Heraclius had managed to push the Sasanians back and reclaim some of their old cities. In the end, the Sasanians were forced to sue for peace, ultimately giving back all the cities they had previously taken, meaning the entire conflict was completely pointless. Well, it wasn't completely pointless, because what it did do was drain both empires of their wealth and allow the Muslim Caliphate in the south to invade and destroy the Sasanians, completely wiping them out in 651. It was not a good thing for the Byzantines, because 23 years later, bam, the Muslim Caliphate have invaded, and they even get so far as to besiege Constantinople. However, the Byzantines under Constantine IV managed to regroup and win some crucial land battles, and very importantly, defeat the Caliphate navy with a new invention, Greek fire, soundly kicking the Caliphate out of Byzantine, at least for the time being. Over in the northeast of the Balkans in 681, Bulgaria destroys the Byzantine army, allowing it to form its first empire. The Bulgarians will have an interesting relationship with Byzantine, as we'll see in the future. Also around the Balkans in the 7th century, the Khazar Empire forms an empire. Who are they? Well, apparently they're very important because they formed one of the most important commercial hubs in the early Middle Ages. Probably a good reason why you haven't heard of them, but we'll get to that. In 711 to 718, the Umayyad Caliphate leads an invasion into Hispania. Now, you may be a little bit confused about the different naming conventions for the Caliphate. To put it simply, the Muslim Empire after the death of Muhammad became the Caliphate, and the Caliphate was controlled in different regions by different dominant clans, in this case being the Umayyad. So the Umayyad Caliphate waltzed into Hispania and obliterate the Visigothic kingdom there, meaning now most of Hispania is controlled by the Caliphate. In 717, with their success in Spain, the Caliphate decide to go for Constantinople again. They conspired with the Byzantine commander Leo III in Anatolia to dispose of the present emperor, which he did, but he betrayed the Caliphate and instead instigated himself as emperor. The Caliphate has now had enough of political intrigue and decided to do things the old-fashioned way by besieging Constantinople. Sounds like a good plan, except their navy was destroyed by the Byzantine navy again, using Greek fire again, allowing Constantinople to be resupplied by sea. Not only that, but their land army was suffering from famine and disease, which is very not good. What's even worse was the Christian crews of their reinforcement navy defected over to Byzantine. Could not possibly get any worse, except that it did because their reinforcement armies were ambushed and destroyed. So finally, after all of that, the Caliphate was forced to lift the siege and retreat. And to top it all off, as they were retreating, their navy was almost completely destroyed by natural disasters. The absolute flogging they got ensured that Byzantine would remain an entity for a few more centuries. Despite all that, the Caliphate was still causing ruckus around Europe, specifically in Hispania, with the Asturians. Now, as I mentioned before, the Umayyad Caliphate had invaded Hispania and took control of most of it. The one bit they didn't get was controlled by a small people group called the Asturians. But now, in 718, the Caliphate invades. The Asturian army of about 300 men, led by a guy called Pelagius, retreats into the dense mountains of the region. As the Caliphate army approaches, they are met with a massive hail of missiles from the mountain slopes. Pelagius, with some of his men hidden in a cave, ambushed the army from the side, causing it to break and run. The Caliphate did manage to regroup and attack again, but by this time Pelagius was reinforced and they were crushed. It was a decisive victory that allowed the Asturians to live mostly unhindered by the Caliphate for quite a while. The Caliphate continued their invasion into Europe in 732, this time the focus on Gaul. They're met by Frankish and Aquitanian forces in the town of Tours, Aquitaine. They are soundly beaten off, allowing the Franks to secure their control over the region. Speaking of which, in 747, one of the most influential people of the early Middle Ages is born. Charlemagne was a Frankish prince that became joint ruler of the kingdom in 768 with his brother. His brother, however, died in 771, allowing him to become sole ruler of the kingdom. During his reign, he dramatically increased the expanse of his empire. This is what it looked like during the beginning of his reign. And this is what it looked like during the height of his reign. He did a lot of campaigning in his time, particularly against the Muslims in Spain, the Saxons in the east, and even the Lombards in Italy. In 800 AD, he was crowned as the first Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in Italy. Charlemagne was also an advocate for learning and education, and during his reign, cultural and intellectual learning was promoted and greatly increased in the Western Church, which was pretty much the center of education at that time. Anyway, he died in 813, most likely from pleurisy, and he left the rest of his empire to his son Louis the Pious. And well, we'll get to that, but it doesn't exactly remain stable. Anyway, moving back a little bit to 778, an army of the Basques ambushes part of Charlemagne's army on Roncesvalles Pass. Now, Roncesvalles Pass is a part of the Pyrenees Mountains situated between the border of France and Spain. Now, this attack was in retaliation for the harsh treatment of the Basque people by the Franks during their occupation. As the army tried to retreat across the Pyrenees, their rearguard was cut off and ambushed by the Basques. The Frankish rearguard, under the control of Roland, just Roland, stood their ground but were inevitably all killed, except this guy who looks like he was just taking a nap. Now, this event doesn't seem particularly important, but it was greatly romanticized in the following years influencing knightly culture and impacting the code of chivalry in the future. Speaking of Charlemagne, guess what he got up to in 782? Yep, that's right, the mass execution of 4,500 Saxons. And he then claimed suzerainty of Saxony, or I guess what was left of it. Moving on to England in 793, there's this peaceful little monastery called Lindisfarne. Everything's fine, except that it's not fine because Vikings show up, enslaving, slaughtering, and drowning everyone they meet, as long as taking everything that isn't nailed down, and also taking the things that are nailed down. This historically marks the beginning of the Viking Age, a time when Norsemen, for multiple different reasons, began raiding different coastal towns across Europe. Now, many scholars will actually tell you that Viking raiding had happened earlier before that, and therefore the Viking Age should be considered sooner. However, no one listens to scholars, so I'm just going to ignore them. Anyway, jumping ahead about 50 years to the Frankish Empire, Charlemagne is long dead, and so is his son Louis. To avoid infighting, Louis split the Frankish Empire into 3 separate regions before he died, so there wouldn't be any conflict. That is literally exactly what happened, and a 3-year civil war happened between the 3 sons. Eventually, they quieted down a little bit and settled on the Treaty of Verdun, the borders of which would help set the shape of Europe for years to come. In 886, Alfred the Great is crowned King of the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Anglo-Saxons are a Germanic people that took control of England after the Romans bugged out in 400 AD. However, as you know, at this present time, England was suffering from massive amounts of Viking raids and invasions. In fact, the previous king, Alfred's brother, was killed in a Viking attack. Now, Alfred was in a particularly prickly situation. There was another Viking invasion, and it was on his shoulders to deal with it. This conflict went on for years with a constant back and forth, but finally in 878 Alfred managed to rally the Anglo-Saxon armies and won a decisive battle in the Battle of Edington, after which he made an agreement with the Vikings to split England between the Anglo-Saxon part and the Danelaw, which was the Viking-controlled part of England. He did a fair bit during his rule. He oversaw the conversion of the Viking warlord Guthrum to Christianity. He defended West Saxon from multiple Viking invasions. He promoted education and encouraged that Old English be used rather than Latin in primary education. He improved the legal system and military structures in the region, and in general just improved people's quality of life. Alfred was described as a merciful man of gracious and level-headed nature who improved and encouraged education. Admittedly, the man who said that was paid to do so, take that as you will. Speaking of the Danish, over in Norway, a man called Harald I is crowned King of the Norwegians in 872. Probably. Not that much is actually known about him. Most written texts are actually 3 centuries after his birth, so it's possible he's entirely fictional. Regardless, what he is best known for is unifying most of Norway under his rule. Probably, if he did exist. Continuing that trend, in 874 Norsemen began settling in Iceland. Now, reasons why are debated. Some people say it's because of conflicts with Harald I, others say it's because of a lack of arable land, and since Iceland was uninhabited, it was a lot more convenient to get their hands on. Greenland as well would also be later settled by Eric the Red in 992, continuing the tradition of colourblind Norsemen giving their countries terrible names. Anyway, back to the Franks in 911 AD, Viking warlord Rollo is defeated in the ill-fated siege of Chartres in the West Frank kingdom. Now the king decides instead of just executing Rollo and his friends, they would actually make pretty good bodyguards. He proposes to give Rollo the Duchy of Normandy in exchange for his loyalty. And Rollo agrees, though it's not like he has much of a choice. Over in the east, the Khazars, who I mentioned were important for some reason, they get beaten up and subjugated by Kievan Rus, the predecessor to modern-day Russia. Probably should not have bothered even mentioning them, but now if somebody asks you, hey, what happened to the Khazars? You can say with confidence, who cares? Then in 991, the last major battle of the early Middle Ages, specifically the Battle of Maldon, in which the Earl Brightnoth and his Thanes lead the English against a Viking invasion near the River Blackwater in Essex. It does not go well, and he dies along with a lot of other people. In the end, the Pope convinces the king to just pay off the Vikings. So, pretty anticlimactic end. And so we have reached the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, I do sincerely appreciate it. This video took a fair amount of work, but I hope you're happy with the end result. Now, was it worth 5 months of production? Probably not. But you know what? That's okay. I also can't guarantee that there will be any more videos after this. Next year I'll probably be juggling studies and work, so it doesn't really make much sense to keep making YouTube videos considering how demanding they are. But you never know, maybe a miracle will happen, God willing, maybe this channel can continue. But if not, it might just get left on the dumpster of YouTube channels. You know what? Once again, I think that's okay. Regardless, I hope you did enjoy it, and I hope you actually got something out of it. Whether that just be a certain interest in a specific part of the early Middle Ages, and this inspires you to do your own research and investigation into that specific period. If that's the case, honestly, I think it was probably worth it. But finally, thank you again for watching, and have a nice week, I guess.